Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind howled down from the Tetons like it carried judgment, and in the shadow of those mountains, a woman named Hester Calloway stood barefoot in the snow, silent and shivering, clutching a bruised rib and a battered heart. She was 23, with tangled brown hair matted to her face and a split lip that had long since stopped bleeding. Behind her, the door of the cabin slammed shut. She did not look back. She had not spoken in 2 days. The man who had bloodied her late husband's brother, would not chase her. Not with snow falling and wolves crying in the dark. He had gotten what he wanted, the land, the cattle, and her silence. But someone else heard her silence. Zeke Gatlin rode through that storm with his coat flapping open and snow melting into the brim of his hat. He had not meant to pass that way, but a broken fence line down by the river had pulled him off the main trail. And then he saw her standing in the snow in nothing but a threadbare linen dress, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide and empty. He dismounted without a word, pulled the blanket from his saddle, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She flinched. He crouched, holding her gaze. "You hurt?" She did not answer. "I ain't gonna ask your name. Not yet. But I am not leaving you here. That all right?" Still, she said nothing. But she did not pull away when he lifted her gently into his arms and set her on the horse. She leaned into the warmth of his coat, and he felt her ribs too sharp beneath her skin. He led the horse with care. The snow deepened as they climbed into the trees. His cabin was 3 miles north, tucked beside a frozen creek. By the time they reached the wooden porch, she had fallen asleep against him. He carried her inside, stoked the fire, and laid her on the cot. She stirred only once when he tried to check her injuries and whispered, "Please! No more." His jaw tightened. "No one's hurting you here." He gave her his bed and slept by the fire. In the morning, she sat on the edge of the mattress, blankets still wrapped around her. Her eyes were red. She watched him pour coffee, her fingers twitching like she wanted to speak. Zeke set the tin cup in front of her. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Hester. That all I need to know." She nodded, eyes flicking to his hands, then the door, then the fire. Always moving. That afternoon, she washed her face in the basin and let him give her a clean shirt. It hung loose over her frame. She never asked for anything, never spoke unless spoken to, and never touched the food until he stepped away from the table. 3 days passed before she let out a sound that was not breath or silence. It came when she heard the creak of the porch board, Zeke returning from checking his traps, and she flinched so hard the tin cup spilled across the floor. She dropped to her knees, hands trembling, trying to mop it up with her skirt. "Hester," Zeke said, crouching beside her. "You do not have to be afraid here." Her eyes welled. "You do not understand." "Then tell me." She shook her head. "He said I would never leave. That no one would believe me. He said I was his now." Zeke's voice dropped. "Who?" "My husband's brother. After Owen died. He kept me. Would not let me leave with my boys." Zeke stood. "Boys?" She nodded. "2. Oliver and Orrin. They are 5 and 3. Her lip trembled. "He said if I ran, he would tell everyone I abandoned them." Zeke's hands curled into fists. "Where are they?" "Still at the homestead. South past the ridge. He lets them play outside when the sun's up." Zeke met her eyes. "Then I am bringing them back." "You cannot, I can," he said. "And I will." That night, he packed a rifle and a coil of rope. At dawn, he left. Hester stood outside the cabin, arms crossed tight, watching the trail vanish into the trees. The wind cut cruel and sharp, but she did not move until he was gone from sight. The hours passed like years. Then, just as the sun dipped past the pines, she saw a shape coming through the trees. A horse. A man. 2 small boys wrapped tight in blankets rode in front of him, clinging to his arms. Zeke swung down and helped them off. "They are all right," he said softly. Hester dropped to her knees in the snow. Oliver, her eldest, ran to her, face smeared with dirt but eyes bright. "Mama!" She pulled both boys into her arms, sobbing into their hair. "I thought I lost you." "You did not," Zeke said behind her. "You never will again." Later, when the boys were asleep inside, curled up in furs by the fire, Hester stepped onto the porch where Zeke leaned against a post. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you help me?" He did not meet her eyes. "Because no one helped my ma." She stepped closer. "Your mother?" Zeke nodded. "She died when I was 16. My pa was cruel. No one stepped in. I swore if I ever saw that again, I would not stay silent." She stared at him, something soft blooming in her chest. "You saved me." He turned then, eyes warm. "No. You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to land." She stepped forward. "Close enough to touch. Still. Thank you." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Your pain ends with me, Hester." She reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. And for the first time, she smiled. Warmth crackled between them like the fire inside. Neither of them said what they felt. Not yet. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the kind born from fear. It felt like peace. The thaw came slowly that spring, as if the land itself was hesitant to believe in warmth again. Snow melted in streaks down the side of the cabin roof and pooled beneath the porch steps. Sap rose in the spruce, and the creek cracked open, shedding its ice in quiet fractures. Inside, the boys had started to laugh. Zeke built them a table from pine boards and let them help sand the legs. Orrin dragged a wooden spoon across the floor like a horse, while Oliver followed Zeke everywhere, asking about traps and berries and whether wolves could read tracks. Hester watched them from the window, hands still and open in her lap, as if she was relearning what safety looked like. Late one afternoon, after the boys had fallen asleep curled around a knotted blanket, she stood in the doorway of the cabin with her arms folded, watching Zeke mend a saddle strap on the porch. Her hair was drying in sun-streaked waves, and her cheeks held a bit more color than they had the week before. "Do you ever miss anyone?" she asked quietly. Zeke didn't look up from the leather. "Every day." She stepped down onto the porch, the hem of her skirt brushing the boards. "Who?" "My older brother," he said. "He died in Kansas when I was 15. Got thrown from a mule while fixing the roof of a barn he had no business climbing." She sat beside him, careful not to touch his arm. "Were you close?" Zeke passed the strap through the buckle. "He used to sneak me pieces of dried apple when Pa wasn't looking. Taught me to read, too." Said a man without books was a blind horse in a wide field. Hester traced a finger over a knot in the porch rail. "I used to read to my boys. Owen taught me. He said it would give them something to hold onto in the dark." Zeke set the repaired strap aside. "You read them stories?" "Only the ones I remembered from my mother. She died when I was 10. After that, we didn't have books. Just scraps I copied onto flour sacks." Zeke turned his head slightly. "You ever think about copying them again?" "I thought about it every night I wasn't allowed to speak." Her voice caught. "I forgot some of the lines. You remember the rhythm?" he asked gently. "I think so." He stood and went inside. When he returned, he held out a stub of charcoal and a square of birch bark. "You could write down what you do remember. Doesn't have to be perfect." She took them slowly, her fingers brushing his. "You always know exactly what to offer. I just pay attention." That evening, while Zeke split logs at the edge of the clearing, Hester sat on the porch with the bark balanced on her lap and began to write. Not just the stories, but names, dates, places she hadn't said aloud in years. She wrote in long, uneven lines until her hand cramped. When the sun dipped low and the birds quieted, she looked up and found Zeke watching her. He said nothing, just nodded once and went back to stacking the wood. The next morning, Oliver carried in a handful of wild violets and dropped them in a tin cup beside the kitchen basin. For you, he said to Hester, then turned to Zeke. I want to shoot a rabbit. Mama says I'm too little. Zeke crouched beside him. You're not too little to learn. But first you help me set the snares. We only take what we need. That's the rule. Hester gave Zeke a long look over the boy's shoulder. You're teaching him careful. He nodded. That's the only way I know how. That night, when the fire shrank to embers and the boys were asleep, she stepped outside wrapped in a shawl. Zeke sat on the porch steps, sharpening his knife with slow, practiced strokes. She lowered herself beside him. You're a good man. His jaw shifted. I try to be. She looked toward the trees, where the wind moved in low waves through the branches. I didn't think goodness could survive out here. It can, Zeke said. But it don't raise its voice. She reached over and touched the back of his hand. Her fingers stayed there. You've given us a life. You gave yourself that, he said. I just made room. She turned his hand over, lacing her fingers with his. Then let me stay in it. He didn't speak, but he didn't pull away. She leaned her head against his shoulder as the night deepened. And for the first time, she didn't feel like something fractured. She felt whole. A warm wind carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth as April settled across the high valley. The snowmelt fed the creek until it ran deep and fast, curling around granite stones like a blade through silk. Zeke had begun clearing the lower field for planting, and the boys dragged sticks behind them, pretending to plow their own rows while Hester patched seams by the cabin steps. She worked steadily, stitching a tear along Oren's sleeve with even pulls. The weight in her chest that had once felt like a stone now lived somewhere quieter still there, but softened. When she looked at her boys, she no longer braced herself for what might be taken. Oliver broke into a run, waving something in his hand. Mama, look what I found! She set the mending down. What is it? He opened his fingers to show a thin feather, striped and curved. It was stuck in a fence post. Zeke glanced over from the field. Sharp-shinned hawk, he said. They nest near the ridge once the snow clears. Oliver tucked the feather behind his ear. Can I keep it? It's yours now, Zeke replied. Hester brushed a hand over her son's hair. You've got his eyes, she murmured. Oliver tilted his head. Whose? She blinked. Your father's. He nodded solemnly, and ran back toward his brother. Zeke leaned his hoe against the fence and walked over, wiping his hands on his trousers. You all right? She nodded once. They're starting to remember him again. It's been so long since they said his name without crying. Zeke sat beside her, elbows resting on his knees. You want them to remember him? I do, she said. But I don't want him to be a shadow either. Just a memory they carry, not one that carries them. He glanced at her needlework. You're doing right by them. I'm trying, she said. I don't always know what comes next. Zeke didn't answer right away. The wind tugged a strand of hair across her cheek, and he reached to tuck it behind her ear, his fingers lingering a second longer than needed. You don't have to know everything right away, he said. You just have to wake up tomorrow and keep doing what you did today. That's enough. She looked at him, eyes steady. And what about you? What do you want? He looked toward the tree line. I want to build something that lasts. Not just fences and cabins. Something that gives more than it takes. She studied him a moment, then stood and dusted off her skirt. Come inside when you're ready. I'll have coffee waiting. That evening, after the boys had fallen asleep in their shared bed, Hester sat at the corner of the table tracing her finger along a drawing Oliver had made, a lopsided house with 4 stick figures, all holding hands. Zeke sat down across from her, rolling a pencil between his thumb and finger. I was thinking, he said, about spring planting. She looked up. What about it? I've got seed for barley and potatoes. But I was thinking we could try squash in that patch near the creek. Sun hits it longer. Her brow lifted. We? He met her eyes. Only if you want to. She nodded slowly. I'd like that. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. I'm not good with big words. Or promises I can't keep. But I want you here. Not just until you find someplace else. I want this to be your place too. She folded the drawing in careful quarters and set it aside. I don't want to leave. His hand reached across the table, palm open. She took it without hesitation. The silence stretched between them, but it was full now. Full of what might grow. Outside, the creek kept running. The thaw was done. By late May, the dirt had warmed enough that Hester could press her fingers into it without flinching. She knelt in the soft tilled earth behind the cabin, sleeves rolled to her elbows, showing pale arms that had once known bruises but now wore only soil and sun. She planted squash seeds in shallow mounds while Orrin toddled between rows with a tin pail, dropping in pebbles he called his guard stones. Zeke watched from a distance, leaning against the fence with a length of baling twine looped through one hand. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer help. Just watched her work, quiet and steady, as though she belonged to the land the same as the creek or the pines. When she stood and brushed her hands clean, she turned to him with a look that held something unspoken but certain. You ever think about putting up a smokehouse? She asked. We'll need one come fall. Zeke nodded once. Got a spot in mind. North edge of the clearing. Shade's good there. She folded her arms. We'll need more salt, too. I was planning to ride down to Du Bois next week. Trade pelts, pick up supplies. She hesitated. Could we come with you? He studied her a moment. You sure? I want the boys to see something beyond these trees. And I'd like to choose what we bring back. Zeke gave a quiet nod. We'll leave after first light Monday. That night she laid out the boys' clothes by the hearth and mended a tear in her own skirt. Zeke whittled by the fire, shaving down a length of cedar into something shaped like a bird's wing. Neither spoke about the trip again. They didn't need to. Monday morning came with a low sky and the sharp scent of rain on the wind. The wagon creaked as they loaded it dried herbs, pelts, and a wrapped bundle of letters Hester had written but never sent. Zeke lifted the boys into the back, settling them beside a crate of onions and a coil of rope. Hester climbed up last, her hand in his just long enough to steady her. As they rolled down the trail, Oliver leaned forward, pointing at everything the bend in the river, a fox darting through the brush, a crow lifting off a fence post with a cry that split the morning. Orrin clutched a cloth bundle in his lap, his face serious. Hester sat beside Zeke on the bench seat, her shawl tucked tight around her shoulders. What was it like the first time you came west? She asked after a stretch of silence. I was 17, he said. Came through Nebraska with a wagon team. Took a job hauling timber near Fort Bridger. She glanced sideways. You came alone? He nodded. Didn't know a soul. Just knew I couldn't stay where I was. Did it feel like running? It felt like surviving. She looked ahead again, eyes narrowed against the wind. I used to think leaving meant giving up. But now I think it's the first thing I ever got right. They reached town near midday. Du Bois was little more than a cluster of wood-framed buildings and a dusty main street, but to the boys, it might have been a kingdom. They stared wide-eyed at the blacksmith's forge and the stacks of flour sacks outside the mercantile. Hester bought bolts of calico, a tin of dried currants, and a new pair of boots for each boy. Zeke traded his pelts for salt and horseshoe nails, then waited while she lingered at the dry goods counter, running her fingers along a row of glass canning jars. On the way out, she paused. I'd like to try jam this year. If the berries hold. You'll need jars for that, he said, and nodded at the row. She smiled, the slow kind that didn't reach her mouth but settled behind her eyes. Then we bring these. They camped that night a few miles east of town, near a break in the hills. Zeke built a fire and cooked beans over the flame while the boys made forts from pine branches. Hester sat on a flat stone, warming her hands. When the boys fell asleep in the wagon bed, she walked to where Zeke stood watching the sky. You've given them something I didn't think they'd ever have again, she said. He looked at her like the words mattered more than she knew. I wanted to give you that too. She stepped closer. You already have. His breath caught, just once, and she reached up, fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. I don't need time to know what grows here, she said. I already feel it. Zeke lowered his head, resting his forehead against hers. You're the strongest thing I've ever seen. Their lips met, not rushed or uncertain, but quiet and sure. When they parted, she stayed close, her hands still resting at his chest. I want to build this life with you, she whispered. Not just live in it. He wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her gently against him. Then we're already home. The squash vines curled like green handwriting across the garden beds by late June. Hester worked barefoot in the mornings, careful not to crush the tender shoots, her hem dark with dew. The boys had taken to building boats from bark and floating them down the creek, their laughter threading through the trees like birdsong. A new kind of rhythm had settled in a quiet, daily steadiness that made room for both work and ease. Zeke had started building the smokehouse with Oliver holding nails between his lips and Orrin dragging short logs across the clearing, insisting on helping. Hester watched from the shade, a basket of washed linen at her feet. She didn't interrupt. Watching had become her way of knowing who they were becoming, and how they moved through the world now that fear no longer followed them. That evening, after the boys were asleep, she sat across from Zeke at the table, a folded piece of paper in her hand. She laid it down between them. I sent off for a land deed, she said. Used the last of what I'd brought with me, what little I could hide from him. It's not much, but it'll be in my name. For the boys. For us. Zeke looked at the paper, then back at her. You didn't have to do that. I did, she said. Because I want to belong to this place the same way you do. Not just by living here. By choosing it. He ran a hand along the edge of the table. You've already made it yours. This cabin's got more life in it now than it ever did before. She leaned forward, her voice low. Then tell me what else it needs. He met her eyes. There's one thing I haven't asked. Not because I didn't want to. But because I was waiting for the right day. She stilled. I'd like to marry you, Hester. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. Not because of what's behind me. No, he said. Because of what's ahead. You're brave. You're steady. You make this place feel like more than just shelter. She reached across the table, her hand closing over his. Then yes. The next morning, Zeke rode to town with Oliver to speak to the circuit preacher. When they returned that afternoon, Orrin came running to meet them, shouting about a rabbit he'd seen near the fence. Hester stepped out from the cabin, apron tied at her waist, and met Zeke's eyes. 2 weeks, he said, handing her a folded slip of paper. The preacher's coming through on his way to Lander. Said he'd stop here. She nodded, then turned toward the boys. That gives us time to make something special. They spent the days preparing. Hester sewed a dress from the fabric she'd chosen in town, a soft blue that she tucked away before the planting. Zeke shaved with the edge of his knife and trimmed his hair in the looking-glass nailed to the cabin wall. Oliver made a crown of willow branches, and Orrin insisted they use the blue tin cup for wildflowers. On the morning the preacher arrived, the sky was clear and bright, the scent of pine heavy in the warm air. The four of them stood under the spruce where Zeke had first taught the boys how to find dry kindling. Hester held Orrin's hand, her other resting lightly against Zeke's arm. The preacher kept it simple. No sermon, no crowd. Just the vows, spoken plain and true. When Zeke said, "With you, every day's worth building," her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Afterward, they shared bread and jam in the shade, the boys running loops around the smokehouse, their voices echoing against the trees. Later, when dusk settled in and the boys had fallen asleep curled together in their bed, Hester stood in the doorway with Zeke beside her, watching the fireflies drift above the grass. You still want to build something that lasts? She asked. He turned toward her. I already am. She leaned into him, her voice quiet. Then let's keep going. They did. Through the years that followed, the garden grew wide and full, the smokehouse stood through every storm, and the creek never ran dry. Hester taught the boys their letters by firelight, and Zeke carved their initials into the porch rail the day they each turned 12. They canned jam in August, hunted in winter, and danced barefoot in the rain when the roof held through a storm. And every morning, before the sun burned off the mist, Zeke would kiss her cheek and say, "Another day." And she'd answer, "Let's make it a good one." They did. Every time. Their life was not marked by grand things, but by small, steady ones: shared work, whispered laughter, the warmth of a hand held over a quiet fire. And when folk passed through and asked how they'd made it all work, Hester would smile and say, "We remembered what mattered." And Zeke would add, "And we never let go." They never did.